Kareem come and sing. We had Afshin Tawfiqian with his beautiful piano music. Of course, Jack Lenz managed so much. Having Jack Lenz was such a gift, having him do all the music. And here we are, we've gone live. Jeremiah is letting me know we're live. And we are wanting to first start off by welcoming our guest, Mr. Robert Stockman. He is here with us, and I'm so glad that he is, because we have an important talk today on the idea of the covenant of the world's religions. Now, this is a huge topic, very heavy topic, if you think about its implications. And of course, we're never going to make light of it, but this is going to be a light version in an hour and a half. This is the topic that can expand way beyond this. So we, of course, invite you to use the resources referenced to learn on your own after this session. We're going to introduce the idea of the covenant of the world's religions. And in religion, a covenant is a formal alliance or agreement made by God with a religious community or with humanity in general. The concept, central to Abrahamic religions, is derived from the biblical covenants, notably the Abrahamic covenant. Christianity asserts that God made an additional covenant through Jesus Christ, called the New Covenant. And a covenant in its most general sense and historical sense is a solemn promise to engage in or refrain from a specified action. A covenant is a type of agreement analogous to a contractual condition. The covenantor makes a promise to a covenantee to do in an affirmative covenant or not to do some action. This would be a negative covenant. So that being stated, what a covenant is, a promise, or in a very legal sense, a contract. Mr. Robert Stockman is our speaker. He is someone who's obtained his master's degree and doctorate in religious studies from Harvard University, where he specialized in history of religion in the United States. He is the author of The Baha'i Faith in America, volumes 1 and 2. I was referring to that prior to this talk, how enthused I was about that, which cover Baha'i events in the United States from 1892 to 1900 and 1901 to 1912, respectively. He wrote Thornton Chase, the First American Baha'i, another lovely book to read. Abdu'l-Baha in America, a volume that reviews Abdu'l-Baha's 8-month-long journey across North America. And another book called The Baha'i Faith, a Guide for the Perplexed, which is an introductory text and part of Bloomsbury's Guide for the Perplexed series. Various articles and book reviews on Baha'is history and theology were published as well in a number of articles, including the Journal of Baha'i Studies Review, World Order, Iranian Studies, Nova Religio, and Religion. And numerous encyclopedia articles were written by Dr. Stockman on the faith, including articles in the Baha'i Encyclopedia. He has lectured on Baha'i topics across the US and Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Israel. He is a frequent contributor to Baha'i panels at the American Academy of Religion. He was an instructor of religious studies at DePaul University in Chicago from 1990 until 2012. And he currently teaches religious studies at Indiana University, South Bend. He has been director of the Willamette Institute, the Baha'i Online Educational Agency since 2000. And further, he has served on the editorial boards of the Baha'i Encyclopedia Project, the Journal of Baha'i Studies, and World Order magazine. He lives with his wife and 2 children in South Bend, Indiana. With this being said, again, this week's topic, the idea of the covenant of the world's religions. We're going to start that beautiful subject. And Dr. Stockman, we want to again thank you on behalf of Clearwater Baha'is here. We want to thank you for joining us for this beautiful Sunday to discuss this very important subject.
Good. Thank you, John. And you said you had your mother had urged you to read Baha'i Faith in America, Volume 2, but you didn't say whether you actually read it or not.
I had read it when I was a child.
That's pretty good because it's awfully long, and I've been laughing at the thought of asking you that question because it's frankly very hard to read.
Well,
So you got
you can
through.
imagine. You can imagine I had to use a dictionary.
Yeah, so if you managed it, I'm actually impressed because that's not an easy thing to do, actually. Good
Appreciate
morning, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see at least some of your faces, and I'm delighted to have a chance to give a presentation on this topic. I was asked to give this talk actually at a fireside in South Bend next month, and I thought, well, I'll try it out in Clearwater, Florida first, and see what I can offer to see if it's of any interest to people. I should add that I'm going to be over on the other side of the peninsula, December 9th, 10th, and 11th at the Mag Carney Baha'i Institute talking about Shoghi Effendi for the weekend. And so that information just started going out, I think this week. And so it's going to be quite an interesting challenge because it's a lot of time to be talking about Shoghi Effendi. I think I need about 8 or 9 hours worth of material. And fortunately, there's some really good videos and things about the Guardian as well. And so we'll no doubt include some of those in order to have something to discuss other than hearing me drone on all the time. Where the subject of the divine covenants is concerned, John has given a very nice definition of the word covenant that's quite comprehensive. But in some ways, I want to broaden the definition out even farther than that, because Baha'is like to talk about two covenants, right? The greater covenant and the lesser covenant. The greater covenant being the covenant that God will always messengers or manifestations, as we like to say, to humanity, to educate humanity. The lesser covenant is the covenant between each manifestation and his, or probably at some point or another, her followers. And so we have these two covenants. But in a way, there's even a third covenant that's even broader than the greater covenant. I don't know what to call it, the covenant of nature or the covenant of creation, perhaps. And this is a covenant that everything in reality, everything in creation exists to educate us. So it's not just revelation, divine revelation, that is our source of education. The physical world itself is a source of education. And I think this is an important thing to add when we're talking about how God guides humanity and strengthens and wisely nurtures us throughout our lives, and it nurtures our societies and civilizations throughout time. There's this passage by Baha'u'llah, maybe I should have shared my screen after all, where it's in, I think it's in Tablets of Baha'u'llah revealed after the Kitab-i Aqdas. Nature in its essence is the embodiment of my name, the maker, the creator. Its manifestations are diversified by various causes, and in this diversity, there are signs for men of discernment. Nature is God's will and is its expression in and through the contingent world. So here you have this idea where Baha'u'llah elsewhere says every created thing exists to, oh, thank you very much. Every created thing exists to reflect a quality or attribute of God. And so we have this basic idea that everything can teach us something about God. I assume that the mosquito teaches us divine persistence, but everything has that capacity to teach us something. And so the idea of what they call nature mysticism, that you see God in the blade of grass and in the sunshine in the beautiful mountains, this idea is quite supported by Baha'u'llah and by the Baha'i writings in general. And so we have this basic understanding that everything exists to educate us, and revelation is just simply one small part of that bigger picture. I was just thinking of another example of that. Perhaps it'll come to me in a minute. So this is an important this is what I mean, why I call it the bigger, greater covenant, you might say. And that's this promise by God to always educate his creatures, always to provide them with guidance. And that's I think a crucial idea. Similarly, because we are all one, because human beings manifest potentially all the attributes of God. Okay, what do you have here? That wasn't the quote I had in mind, but that's all right. Since all human beings potentially can manifest all the attributes of God, this is the difference between us and the mosquito, is that a mosquito manifests only a small subset of divine attributes, but we have the capability of manifesting them all. Because we have that capability, that this is another way of understanding the oneness of humanity. All human beings have these capabilities. Hence, all human beings must be treated with love and respect. And all human beings, of course, by being able to learn about God through nature, can also help teach us about God as well. So we can learn from each other that way. And this, of course, is also part of the reason why we need to have revelation to guide our reason. One of the things that Baha'u'llah says is that the most important gift that we've been given is the gift of understanding. And this gift of understanding basically is an emphasis on the rational nature of human beings, that we can look at things, we can understand them logically and rationally, we can figure out their connections, their relationships to each other, we can figure out cause and effect in very sophisticated ways. And so again, this is a crucial element of something all of us have, and therefore it's essential that we help all human beings develop these capabilities. We can't create a world where some people are able to develop them and some people are prevented because of the social structures for developing them. And so this emphasis on the oneness of humanity therefore leads to the emphasis in the Baha'i writings on equality of all peoples, equality of men and women, the need for universal education, that all people need to have access to the ability to read and write, for example, so they can share their ideas more widely and can pick up the ideas of the entire civilization through the stored books that provide this education to us. So these are a few of the, I think you might say, the background principles when we work our way towards talking about this greater covenant of God. It then, in a sense, follows logically, since these capacities, since the universe is an educative experience, it follows logically, you might say, that God has always wanted to guide humanity in its development. Unfortunately, God doesn't provide us with everything we need to know and then force us to immediately learn it. If that were the case, we would have a perfect society now. We would have had a perfect society thousands of years ago. But of course, he has to leave it to us to figure these things out, figure out how to apply them, and how to share them with each other. And this is the reason why the various religious traditions in the world are different from each other, and why they they start off at a certain point and they all develop and change as well over time as their communities change and develop. So there is this idea, therefore, in the writings, that God has always sent messengers. Abdu'l-Baha says that tens of thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were messengers of some sort. And Abdu'l-Baha, in this new book that came out, Pearls of Wisdom, you may have seen it, as little 150-page compilation of Abdu'l-Baha's tablets, prayers, and talks. And one of the talks in Pearls of Wisdom says that there are three kinds of prophets. There are, of course, manifestations of God, which are these great sort of infallible beings that provide us with guidance, provide us with teachings, and that they are rare. They come every few hundred years, every 1,000 years or so, depending on the place and the time. Then there are what the Bible calls the lesser prophets. Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah are all examples. These are individuals who exist under the shadow of a manifestation, right? And they amplify the manifestation's teachings. They provide some interpretations about them. They provide some help, guidance in implementing the teachings of the manifestation. And certainly the Old Testament and the prophets after Moses are the best examples of that. In other religious traditions, they're often not called prophets. They're often called something else. The imams are an example of that. I think in Islam, they're lesser than a manifestation of God. They're probably not considered a lesser prophet exactly, but they clearly have some sort of station that's similar to a lesser prophet. Then Abdu'l-Baha says there's a third kind of prophet, which he calls local prophets, prophets that only arise in a small area and only affect a small number of people. And I think those are the kinds of prophets that the tribal peoples of the world have had. Because frequently, if you go back in time, let's say to North America in the year 1000, before they were well before the arrival of Columbus, North America at that time probably had 3, 4, 5 million people scattered over 5 million square miles of land. If you include all of northern Canada, of course, most of the people were living in southern Canada, or what is today the United States, and especially in Mexico. So they were scattered. They were thinly populated areas, low population density generally. They spoke probably 300 or 400 different languages, most of which were not comprehensible to each other. They had trade networks. We know that materials were moving, for example, from Mexico up to Cahokia. Cahokia was a town of perhaps as many as 10,000 people across the river from St. Louis. They were building earthen mounds that were 150 feet high. We don't know what was on top of the earthen mounds, whether they were temples or whether they were palaces for a sort of king. So we know people were moving things around. We know there was commerce. There was some exchange of ideas. But even under those circumstances, a prophet would have a great difficulty providing information that could travel a long distance amongst all these peoples, because they lived very different ways. They spoke very different languages. So it's not clear how you'd have someone who's like a manifestation who could really bring the teachings that would spread very widely. Much easier to have a lot of local prophets instead. So this is part of this idea of the greater covenant, of God always sending guidance to humanity. You have these three different classes of beings who provide some sort of guidance or wisdom or stories, perhaps stories that have a point, or hymns that people can sing that will help them remember teachings. And these are the ways that before there was literacy, before these teachings were spread. So Baha'is believe that there have always been these figures that have guided humanity. We've lost the names of most of them, of course. Here in North America, the Lakota up in the North and South Dakota are quite convinced, the Baha'is there are quite convinced that the white buffalo calf woman was a manifestation of God, or at least a prophet of some sort. And she brought to the Lakota most of their sacred traditions, especially the traditions about smoking the pipe. And the cycle of stories about her are repeated every year during the Sundance. So the traditions are maintained and preserved through this annual ritual of reciting the stories at the same time that the Sundance occurs. So this is another example of how Baha'is would see the divine guidance. Now, part of the Baha'i notion of the covenant is that each manifestation of God promises another one, promises that the chain will continue into the future. And this, of course, is the notion of the return of Christ in Christianity. We see this in many different religious traditions. In Islam, you have the idea of the coming of the Mahdi for the Sunni Muslims, the La'em for Shiite Muslims. Some Muslims believe there are two figures that are coming in the future. For the Jews, it's the idea of the Messiah, which Jesus appears to have made the claim to be. But you also have this idea in other religious traditions as well. Sometimes it's a more legendary kind of tradition, even amongst the various Native American tribes on this continent. There have been stories about the future coming of something or someone. Certainly down in Mexico, when Cortez arrived, many of the Aztecs thought that he was the fulfillment of a prophecy that a white-skinned or light-skinned man would come from the east. And so they saw Cortez as fulfilling that promise, which of course was a disaster for them. And it resulted in the destruction of Aztec civilization. And by the way, they had books and they had philosophers. They had really quite a sophisticated civilization, mostly 99% destroyed. So you have this promise. In the Eastern traditions, like Hinduism and Buddhism, it's a little more difficult to locate a concept of covenant. You don't actually have a word that's exactly equivalent to the Western notion of the covenant, but you have the promise of a future. For the Hindus, there's the notion of the coming of the Kalki avatar at the beginning of the next cycle. In Hinduism, time is cyclical. So you have prophetic figures arise, society moves forward, and then it collapses, and you have another figure who arises and brings it about again. So you have this cycle of religion in Hinduism, with the next avatar being the Kalki avatar coming in the future. The stories about the Kalki avatar, of course, are, as you might imagine, in all the religious traditions, are kind of all over the place. Certainly, if you think about the examples in Islam, that before the coming of the Da'em, the Dajjal, the Antichrist comes and he has to ride a donkey. The distance between the ears of the donkey is like a mile. So this is a gigantic donkey in the sky, you know. So you have these kinds of ideas in all the religious traditions, which are quite fanciful, and trying to figure out what to make of the traditions it becomes quite difficult, really. In Buddhism, you have a very interesting situation, because the Buddha, the stories that the Buddha told are generally understood to be stories about his own previous lives. And in these stories, the Buddha himself came back to the earth many, many times. And every time he came back to the earth, he learned something, so that when he finally came the last time, 2,500 years ago, he was then able to become the first truly enlightened one. And by becoming enlightened, he was then able to explain the nature of the world, the nature of reality to people, so that they could then similarly become enlightened. I can go into elaboration about what his notion of this nature of reality is some other time, maybe. But this was the idea. And so many of these stories about the Buddha are stories that are similar to stories about previous manifestations. But who knows whether any of them are, whether they're legend or myth. You know, the idea between these two is that something that's legendary has a historical core behind it, and then you have accretions to the historical core that are additions of some sort, as opposed to the notion of myth. A myth is a sacred story which conveys a truth which may have no historical basis at all. In a way, it doesn't have to have a historical basis, because the spiritual point of that story is true whether it's historical or not. So that's the difference, and we don't really know whether any of these accounts of the previous lives of the Buddha are historical or legendary or mythical. Probably mythical, near as I can tell. But in addition to this chain, which Buddhism has through these previous avatars, you see, there's also the claim that the Buddha will return in the future. This is sometimes called the fifth Buddha. Sometimes he's called Maitreya Amitabha. He's called different things in the Buddhist tradition. But there is this idea of another Buddha that will come in the future. So even if you don't call it a covenant, you still have the idea that, I won't call it God, divine, the divine forces of the world have been educating humanity, and that these divine forces of the world have been guiding humanity through specific individuals. And there will be an individual who will come in the future and renew religion and continue that guidance. And indeed, that renewal is necessary because the Buddha said that the Dharma, the truths of his religion, will become gradually diluted, perhaps is a way of putting it, gradually misunderstood, and it'll be harder and harder for people to achieve enlightenment in the future. So it'll be necessary for another Buddha to come in order to solve that problem. By the way, right after the Buddha announced his mission and began to teach people, and people began to accept him, and he established monks and monasteries to continue to spread his faith, because that was the best way in a society with no writing to spread religion, is to establish monasteries. And then these monasteries are these expert teachers who will then continue to go out and teach other people and create new monasteries and spread the faith that way. Well, women were very impressed. And so women began to come to the Buddha and said, well, can I be enlightened too? Can I become a priest and a monk? And the Buddha said no at first, perhaps because it was really premature. The religion was new, and it would have been shocking in that society for women to become celibate. Because in those societies, of course, in those days, every family was very much was necessary for the family to continue into the future. Otherwise, the parents in their old age would have no one to take care of them if they made it to old age. And then the resources the family had been painstakingly accumulating in terms of, land or buildings would be dissipated. So the idea of women being celibate was really very unacceptable in those kinds of societies. So he said no. Then they got his mother and some of the other women in the household to ask him, and he said yes. He said, yes, well, women can now be ordained, but the Dharma will deteriorate twice as fast. Perhaps because now that more people can be enlightened, it'll speed the cycle up, So anyway, that's sort of an aside. So that's this idea again of covenant. You can see in Buddhism, there's this idea of the guidance coming to humanity and will continue to come in the future and has been continuing in the past, and that every avatar of the Buddha was building on the knowledge of the previous avatar of the Buddha. Of course, this was understood as the same person coming back and learning more and more, but you still have this idea that the avatars were steadily learning more and more. We also see this, I think, in the various religions around the world, the histories of these religions. One of the very interesting sort of observations that you can make is you can almost create a chart, with a vertical, what do you call these? The vertical and horizontal lines in the chart. And the vertical line, let's make the vertical line how long ago the manifestation of God came. So as you go up, it's farther and farther in the past when the manifestation of God came. On the horizontal line, we will chart how long it took from the time of the manifestation to the time his teachings are written down. Now, it's not quite a straight line, a diagonal straight line, but it's kind of close to a diagonal straight line. Those of you who know statistics will agree that if we made it a logarithmic scale, it would look like a good straight line, of course, because that tends to push everything together. Basically, the longer in the past you go, the less information we have historically about these manifestations of God. This makes a lot of sense because writing took a long time to develop. Writing is a complicated technology. And even today, just because something is written down doesn't necessarily mean we can understand it and repeat it. If you've ever tried reading a note by someone who's got really bad handwriting, you know that in many ways, writing is still a mnemonic device to help remember something, because you have to kind of piece together and figure out what, from the clues in the writing, what it means. This was even more true in the past. When the printing press was invented 500 years ago, the printers decided they had to do certain things. One of the things they decided they had to do was standardize spelling, so that everybody spelled words the same way. Another thing they decided to do is invent punctuation. Before the printing press, there were no punctuation standards. So they invented simple things like periods, commas, exclamation marks, quotation marks, these kinds of things. If you've ever looked at a text by Baha'u'llah in the original, one of the things you will notice is there's no punctuation. So people who are converting that text into modern Arabic and Persian text, they paragraph it and they add punctuation in order for us to understand it better. If you go back farther in time, let's say to the time of Jesus, it's even more complicated. At the time of Jesus, they had no capital versus small letters, because that's also true of Persian. And they didn't even have the convention of putting spaces between the words. So what you had was a continuous string of letters, and you had to figure out where each word ended and which each word began in order to read it. And of course, no periods. And sometimes there would be paragraph breaks where people felt they ought to go, but that was not standard in the originals either. This is a very difficult kind of text to read, especially with no standard spelling. But even that is better than 500 years earlier. If you go back to, well, let's say 700 BC in what is today Israel, literacy was just beginning to really spread in Israel amongst the Israelites. If you go back even farther to the time of Moses, 1200, 1300 BC, probably no literacy at all at the time of Moses. You do have, of course, the stories about him writing down the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, but near as we can tell, there was no literacy at all in the land of Israel, really until, well, probably at least a century after Moses, when there was the beginnings of people using the Phoenician alphabet to write Hebrew. So there was some efforts very early on, but these were not efforts to write down sacred words. These were efforts to maintain contracts and treaties. That's what you use writing for at first. Part of the problem with using writing for contracts and treaties is that writing becomes this grubby business thing that you don't want to use for sacred things, because that would sully the sacred things by putting them down in this grubby writing that the businessmen use. So that actually slows down this tendency to write things down. Here, as we can tell, the teachings of Moses were an oral tradition from the time of Moses, say let's call it 1250 BC, until around 950 BC, during the reign of Solomon. It was during the reign of Solomon that the temple was built in Jerusalem. Jerusalem became the capital under David. Solomon built a beautiful temple. He established a priesthood, moved them into the temple, into, well, very nice buildings next to the temple. They I'm sure, lived comfortably. And they were the ones, oh, by the way, and his palace was right up against that. You've got your temple here, you've got your priest's quarters here, and then you've got the palace here. So they're all cheek and jowl with each other. And then, of course, the palace bureaucrats are also the other ones who know how to read and write. So presumably the temple priests and the palace bureaucrats are getting together. I won't say over coffee, because they didn't have coffee in those days, over a cup of wine and a loaf of bread, and talking and speculating, saying, we need to write down the national story. We need to remember who we are. We need to remember what Jehovah has done for us. And so near as we can tell, that was the beginning of the effort to write down what becomes Old Testament text around 950. And when they did that, they used the oral. So there was this 300-year period of time where the stories about Moses were first told over the campfire and then told around the fire pit inside the house. And then these stories get written down by the temple priests and the bureaucrats 300 years later. And the result is that we have 3 different versions of the 10 Commandments. People think they're all the same, but they're not actually quite the same. 3 different versions of the 10 Commandments. And then a lot of the other teachings of Moses are probably oral tradition that developed in agricultural societies, because a lot of them have to do with how to live in an agricultural society, which of course they weren't while they were wandering in Mount Sinai. So how much do we really know about Moses? It's very hard to know. It's hard to know even about Jesus, frankly, but it's even harder to know about Moses. With Muhammad, the oral tradition lasted for a very short period of time, because after Muhammad died, it was decided they had to start writing down the Quran. Some of it was already written down in Muhammad's lifetime, as it says, on the shoulder blades of sheep and on leather and wood and anything else they had that they could write on. So they used whatever materials were available to write down parts of the various chapters of the Quran. And then under, I think it's Uthman, who lived the 3rd caliph, he lived 15 or 20 years after the passing of the prophet. He decided it had to be all written down. And so the Quran was then actually written down at that time while people who knew the Prophet Muhammad were still alive and therefore could remember it correctly. And a lot of Westerners, some Western scholars, have poo-pooed this claim that the Quran was written down almost immediately. People have even speculated that it wasn't written down for 200 or 300 years and that there was no Muhammad, or if there was, he actually lived in southern Israel, and all kinds of very strange theories. But you know, in Yemen, there is a Quran which everybody agrees is very old. And a few years back, they carbon dated it. And it turns out the carbon dating overlaps with the period of Uthman. It's from like a little before Uthman to a little bit after Uthman, because you can't, date things perfectly with carbon 14. But indeed, the Quran was written down very quickly after the passing of the prophet. The stories about Muhammad, they took longer. They were 100 to 150 years in some cases. And there was a whole science developed by the Muslim scholars to be sure they were accurately recorded, or at least as accurately as they could be. So this is also part of this covenant from God, that as as humanity advances, the spiritual teachings diffuse out into the world, around the messenger of God. The society continues to improve and develop. And a lot of that is technological advancements. These technological advancements create whole new cultural possibilities, whole new cultural, opportunities. And these cultural opportunities sometimes are violent. The Romans, because they had advanced writing systems and they had papyrus, were able to conquer a huge area and maintain an empire for several hundred years and tax everybody. And they maintained fairly detailed tax records on everybody in the Roman Empire using papyrus. And that was something we know a fair amount about, because in Egypt, there was a city built on the edge of the desert, and the city's garbage dump was in the desert. You don't want to use good land for garbage dumps. There's a shortage of irrigated land, so you walk a quarter mile out of the town, out into the sand dunes, and you dump your garbage there. And that particular garbage dump, because the rainfall is only 2 inches a year, all the papyrus has survived. And starting in, I think, mid-20th century, the scholars began to go through all that papyrus and read it and classify the documents, tens of thousands of papyrus fragments. So, for example, there's one particular person's records that were thrown out when he died, and we have all of his tax receipts. And when he got old enough, like me, when he needed glasses, and of course they didn't have glasses in those days, he was a weaver. So he got an exemption and was able to weave, he could only weave about half as much cloth. So his tax records show that he was being taxed for doing less weaving. All these little details, adoption records, children being adopted, soldiers writing home to mom. Of course, they couldn't write, but they'd find someone who could write the letter, and the imperial post would carry it back to their hometown, and someone would then take it over to the mother, and the mother would take it to the marketplace and have someone read the letter to her, and then she would have that person write a letter back. So we have actually letters from Roman soldiers back to their moms and back, believe it or not. So we know a lot about that society now. And we know really that all that technology was so much better than 1,000 years earlier. Can you imagine how much better it would have been after the invention of the printing press? You can see how society keeps developing and advancing. And of course, the advancement also means the armies get bigger, they get more destructive. The capacity for killing people also grows. The desire to create bigger and bigger empires grows. And we see that, of course, in the 20th century with the creation of the huge European empires and the fact that half the planet was colonized by them. And even earlier that all of Latin America, all of North America is colonized by Europeans, and the natives are in North America mostly wiped out, genocidal conditions. Similarly in Latin America, though there were all along more people in Latin America than in North America, so the natives survived in some ways more numerously. So we see that this capacity grows, and why we need messengers of God that bring even more complicated, more sophisticated teachings to humanity. And that's also part of this greater covenant. Well, that gives you some idea of this Baha'i notion of the greater covenant, and some examples of how it's necessary. Perhaps I should say one more thing about this idea, the idea that every messenger of God brings a new civilization. This is another aspect of this idea of the greater covenant. We see this, the clearest example of this again in Moses. Moses appears to have led out of Egypt probably just a few thousand people. There was, of course, some sort of miraculous event crossing the Reed Sea. It's usually called the Red Sea in the Bible, but the Hebrew is actually Reed Sea because it was an area full of reeds. And Moses's people, who probably were already Hebrew speaking because they were slaves from Canaan, returned to Canaan, and they probably converted most of the rural population to the worship of Jehovah, which was the name of their God. I'm using Jehovah just because it's simpler than the story of exactly what Moses called him is complicated. So we'll just use Jehovah for now. And this people built a whole civilization there in the rocky hills of Judea and the great flat agricultural plains of Galilee. A remarkable civilization. And at the time, Egypt and Iraq were weak states. And as a result, they were able to expand outward all the way down into the Sinai Peninsula, all the way north past Damascus, all the way up to the Euphrates River under Solomon, and create the largest empire that that area of the Middle East had at that time. And Jerusalem would have been one of the largest cities in the Middle East for a period of time also. Of course, that probably means it had 25 to 50,000 people. We're not talking about a big place, but for that time, it was a big place, with people coming all the way up from Sheba. Remember the story about the Queen of Sheba coming up and meeting Solomon. Sheba would have been somewhere down in Yemen or Ethiopia, which is a long way to come up the Red Sea to establish trading relations. with Israel. So that's probably the best example of the effect of a manifestation of God on creating a civilization. Islam also, with the story of course, Muhammad coming to Mecca, city of maybe 5,000 people, 6,000 people, 10,000 people at the most, wasn't very big. And then by the time the prophet dies, the entire Arabian Peninsula has accepted him. So now we're probably talking about several 100,000 people. And then, of course, under Omar, one of the caliphs who succeeded him, they conquer Jerusalem, they conquer Iraq, they conquer Alexandria and Egypt, they conquer Damascus, and much of what is today the Middle East becomes controlled by Muslims. Probably now they control 10 million people, from 5,000 to 500,000 to around 10 million, that kind of a thing, in a matter of 50 years, 30 years. Well, no, let's say 50 years. And then under the Muslims, the population is not forcibly converted. They gradually convert to Islam. And indeed, there are large areas of the Middle East today where there are a lot of Christians left. Egypt is 5 to 10% Coptic. Syria is 10 or 15% Christian. Lebanon is, 20 or 30%, 40% Christian. Palestine used to be 50% Christian. So there were still Christians around. They weren't forcibly converted. But the true genius of Islam was to build a civilization in collaboration with all of these other people. And so the Christians and the Jews help build the mosques because the Muslims don't have any engineering capability. The Christians and the Jews teach them. And the Christians and Jews, when they begin to speak Arabic, when they become Arabic speakers, they translate Greek philosophy into Arabic. And by the time the Islamic armies are getting to India, they're translating Indian texts from Sanskrit into Arabic. And they're translating Middle Persian texts into Arabic. And so you have in Baghdad by the year 800, this enormous city of 500,000 to 1 million people with many centers of learning, sort of future universities. Think of them as research institutes, with people compiling translations and trying to read Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus in Arabic, and thinking about what the implications these philosophers have for the Quran and understanding who God is. So you get these brilliant expositions of philosophy as a result of the Arabs learning Greek philosophy. You get Avicenna and you get Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. And over in Europe, you have very little knowledge of Greek philosophy until they translate it into Latin from Arabic. And then you have Aquinas creating his great syntheses of Christian theology using Aristotle in Latin, ultimately translated from Arabic and then ultimately from Greek, because they couldn't translate at that time from Greek to Latin anymore. They didn't have the people to do it. And so you have the great monuments of Christian theology in the Middle Ages dependent upon the Islamic philosophers, who in turn were dependent upon the Greeks. And so you see this genius of creating civilization that Muhammad sparked. So that's another example, I think, of the power of the divine teachings to build and to translate, to transform civilization and educate. It's not just the revelation itself, but the love of learning that the revelation sparks. So those are a few thoughts about the whole topic. Perhaps this is a bit of a ramble, but I hope people found something there of interest and use. And now maybe we can have some questions.
Yes, now would be the time for our audience, and I'll look online to see if we have any questions. I was interested real quick. Towards the beginning of your discussion about the Aztec prophecy, was that in reference to Abdul Baha, man from the east?
Which Aztec prophecy are you talking about?
Well, when they first thought that Cortez, when he came over.
Oh, it has nothing to do with Abdul Baha.
Oh, okay.
This is hundreds of years before Abdul Baha.
Yeah, that's in Mexico with Montezuma. This is like very long ago, pretty much around, I think it was the 1400s, no, 1500s.
1500s, beginning of 1509 or whenever. I think that's when Cortez comes up over the mountains, looks down into the valley of Mexico and sees a city larger than almost every city in Europe. Some people say Tenochtitlan had 200,000 people.
And they were also committing human sacrifice, which was considered an egregious act. That's why, at least morally, Cortez was able to justify the wholesale war and slaughter of all the people in that area.
Yeah, and they also
from sacrifice.
They were also able to make a fair amount of money off their gold and silver too while they were at it. This is the complicated relationship that people have with when they conquer, when they have with other people.
Yeah, in history class, they called it the 3 Gs: God, glory, and gold.
Yeah, and this is a terrible thing. Something like the population of Mexico over a century drops by 95%, I think is the number I've seen. 10 or 15 million people down to a few 100,000. Except, of course,
across the Americas. This is going to be the case across the Americas from north all the way to south. And they've attributed it to a giant pandemic that apparently the people of the West were not immune to, and they died off.
Yes.
So, for example, when the English pilgrims came to the North American coasts, there was very few people there, and that's why they say that it was a very different environment when they had entered.
Yeah, the Puritans in the Massachusetts found all kinds of abandoned Indian villages, probably because about 20 years earlier, some European fishermen showed up, traded with the natives, and also gave them smallpox, or one of the other, maybe measles, because there was no smallpox, measles, and a few other European, or I should say Eurasian diseases had not arrived there. Probably because the domesticated animals in Eurasia, there were far more domesticated animals in Eurasia. There were very few to domesticate in the Americas. You could domesticate llamas and guinea pigs and dogs, but they didn't have large animals, beasts of burden, like cows and pigs and sheep. And human beings picked up diseases from those animals and suffered very severely in Eurasia as a result, but the population then developed a sufficient amount of immunity so that the effect of the diseases was lessened, but the Americas didn't have that benefit. And so sometimes 99% of the population of a village would die when a disease from European disease would arrive. But one of the fascinating results of all this is that all that gold and silver pouring into Europe was a stimulation for urbanization, for creating universities, for printing books. And there's actually an article I think it was in the Journal of Middle East Studies about 20 years ago that showed that gold and silver had poured into Europe so much that there was inflation all the way over in Turkey because the value of gold and silver actually dropped. And so there was inflation. That's how much gold and silver they got from the Americas. And it stimulated the development of modern Europe immensely. Modern Europe was built on the backs of the work of the Indians and, of course, the backs of African slaves.
So I have a question about the subject of the covenant from earlier. There's this concept from the Bible about the rainbow being a symbol of the promise. A lot of people who are introduced to the concept of the covenant, particularly, are exposed to the subject of Noah and the flood and the rainbow and what it symbolized. what is the relevance of this story to the covenant as you've been describing it, and how can one, in remembering this from their times as a child, learning about the Bible and the New Testament from this school of thought, how can they connect with the covenant as you've been describing it?
Well, in some ways it may be a little difficult, but I like to think of this as a really beautiful sacred story that we have about Noah and the flood. Of course, the story comes from Mesopotamia. Ultimately, that's one of the stories that the Hebrew Bible picks up from there, probably from the exile. And Mesopotamia, as you know, is extremely flat, and so you would get floods that would cover thousands of square miles of Mesopotamia in the spring when you had a rainfall and the snow melt up in the mountains. So the story reflects that fact, not the flooding of the entire earth, but the entire earth as those people knew it, which was this huge populated area of cities and irrigation canals and fields. And so it's a story again of to me, it's a story of, people not following a covenant, in this case, disobeying God and being punished for their disobedience of God, but then God deciding he'll never do it again to wipe everyone out, and puts the rainbow in the sky as a promise, as an example of this promise. Now, I don't take any of that literally. The rainbow was possible before Noah, presumably because water passing through raindrops have a prism effect on the water, and that would have been true even before the flood, if there was a flood. So I wouldn't take that as a scientific statement, but as a story of God's concern about humanity and God's desire that humanity learn and grow and move forward. That to me is the promise of the story of Noah, and the promise that humanity will never be wiped out again is perhaps a promise that we don't have to worry about nuclear war wiping us out too. I don't know. So maybe it's a promise for our future too. Someone asked a question about the Kitabe Akdas. It popped up and went away. I'm not sure if the notion of the Lesser Covenant is actually in the Kitabe Akdas or not. That's an interesting question. You will find it in tablets of Baha'u'llah revealed after the Kitabe Akdas. I think you'll find it in the Eshraqat or the Tarazat or the Besharat, one of those tablets, where there is this promise. Whether the term Lesser Covenant is used there, I don't know. I'd have to look. I'm not sure whether it's a term Abdu'l-Baha first used or whether it's also in the writings of Baha'u'llah. The idea is in the writings of Baha'u'llah for sure, but the term perhaps not. I don't know.
Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
So there's a question about the subject of the covenant being this promise of the divine presence. And of course, the Kitab-i-Iqan dwells on the subject of the divine presence, as does many of Baha'u'llah's works, explaining this constant renewal of revelation and the resurrection, meaning the return of the manifestation of God and the resurrection of the faith of God. That's something that is nice to talk about. But the subject of this promise of the divine presence and this covenant, what is this covenant? Is this the greater covenant between God and man? And the next part of the question is with regards to, again, this promise of the divine presence. Why is it that there's lack of clarity on this subject?
Well, I'm not sure where the promise of the divine presence per se is located. Certainly, it's located in the writings of Baha'u'llah. I think that's what you meant by the Iqan. I'm not sure if previous religions have that promise. I'd have to think about that for a while. It has a lot to do with what you mean by divine presence, because, for example, in Buddhism, even the very concept of God is not present in the way Westerners would expect it to be. I'll put it that way. It's actually more present in Mahayana Buddhism than it is in Theravada, and Theravada is the older form. Mahayana developed 500 to 1,000 years or 1,500 years after the Buddha, and added a whole bunch of sermons of the Buddha that were, well, sermons attributed to the Buddha that people claimed that in their past lives they heard this sermon and they wrote it down now in this new life of theirs in Tibetan or in Chinese or whatever the language they were using at home. And so you have ideas that are much more like a divine presence notion there. The idea of the Buddha nature in all people, the Buddha nature in all things. But that's not the same thing as the divine presence exactly. In Islam, I think the notion of the divine presence, if you're thinking about divine actually being in the world, that would be hard to find in Islam, I think. So you've got the quote here, thank you. The Rezvan of the divine presence cause him that hath forsaken his country and is treading the seeker's path to enter the tabernacle of.
It's mentioned 5 times in here at least. So there's this reference, and then there's a reference here, the Qathar of the divine presence.
Divine presence.
This is again pertaining to the subject of the manifestation of God.
Well, the manifestation of God in the Baha'i terms is the divine presence, of course.
Yes. Yes.
But the idea that the manifestation is the divine presence is not an idea that's necessarily strong in other religious traditions. Now, you could say it's true in Christianity, in that the idea of Jesus being part of the Trinity, being, the Christ is part of the Trinity, therefore, there's a sense of the divine presence in Christ, certainly. So you certainly have it in Christianity. I would say you might have it in some sense in Shia Islam because of the idea of the 14 immaculate ones, the 14 infallibles, which would be the 12 imams and Fatima and Muhammad. But I'm not sure if I would call the divine presence in Fatima. So
here we
it's
have
an interesting question. I'm not sure how you define divine presence. Would be hard to define in other religious traditions, is what I'm saying.
Understood. So here we have this sentence. It says, amongst the proofs demonstrating the truth of his revelation is this, that in every age and dispensation, whenever the invisible essence was revealed in the person of his manifestation, certain souls obscure and detached from all worldly entanglements would seek illumination from the sun of prophethood and moon of divine guidance, and would attain unto the divine presence.
Right.
And second sentence, for this reason, the divines of the age and those possessed of wealth would scorn and scoff at these people.
Yeah, I mean, what this is saying is that they met the manifestation of God, and when they met the manifestation of God, they experienced something that was more than experiencing a human being. You see what I'm saying? They experienced some sort of something superhuman or divine meeting these individuals. And so they would then, in their own words, try to explain what it was that they encountered, what it was they experienced, and others would laugh at them. Now that would be, I mean, that's true certainly of the people who met the Buddha. They had an understanding of him that he was totally unique and totally different from anybody they had ever met before. They wouldn't have called it the divine presence, but they would have called it enlightenment, I suppose. Nirvana. And nirvana is a very complicated word. Nirvana is both a condition that a person can attain, but nirvana is also a reality of its own. Nirvana is outside this world. Nirvana is deathless. Nirvana has always existed. Nirvana is ineffable. So that's kind of like the divine presence, you might say. And it's something that if you can truly achieve enlightenment, you experience it, you enter it, you achieve it, okay? I guess the nearest equivalent in Western mystical terms would be um, um, meeting God, becoming part of God, fusing your personal reality with God, something like that. And these are ideas that you find in Christian and Muslim mysticism. It's the thing that got Al-Hallaj killed. He supposedly said as he was being burned at the stake. He's a great mystic, Muslim mystic from 1200. He supposedly said as he's being burned at the stake, "Ain al-Haq, I am the truth. I am God," basically. He may not have said, but that's its experience of the divine presence, you might say. It's this notion of your merger with the divine. I'm glad to know you know how to use Oceans 2. I'm going to have to get some help from you because it's almost impossible to search anything in Oceans 2 here.
So I've been learning, and I think the process is getting simpler for people as it is, constantly updated.
Yeah, I understand that it's being. I don't think my version updates itself, but yeah.
So here, on the subject of what you were just mentioning, there's
Yes.
a passage from Baha'u'llah on the subject.
This is in Gleanings and the Iran, maybe.
Yes. So in Iran, there is a subject of 3 statements: I am God, I am the messenger of God, I am the servant. Well, 4. I am the seal of the prophets. We are the servants of God.
Yes.
And that they're all
Yes.
equally true.
Yes. Yes. And you find the same kind of thing in the Gospel of John. The Father and I are one. Why dost thou call me good? Only the Father which is in heaven is good. So you have this notion that Jesus is God and Jesus isn't God, right there in the Gospel of John. I once compiled a list of all these sayings in the Gospels that parallels this passage.
So here, if you press on filter, you hit on Baha'i, and then you select the book you want from Baha'u'llah, as you see here. You apply the filter, and then it's only on the subject of the Iran.
Fantastic.
So if I
even got Brent Poirier's in there, that's good.
Yes. So there is this subject here, which it didn't show up when I was looking for it.
Attainment of the divine presence, yes. Yeah, that means the attainment of the manifestation in this case.
So
yeah. In the movie Ben-Hur, you actually see it portrayed, right? When Charlton Heston is being led off to as a slave to row in the galleys, and he's almost dying of thirst. And a woman tries to offer him water, and the soldier prevents it. And then Jesus offers him water, and he looks up into Jesus's eyes, and he has this epiphany, right? That's Hollywood's version of experiencing the divine presence, right there. Not a very good example, but it's the same idea. The divine essence, yes. I'm not sure how much this relates to the subject of the covenant exactly, though.
So Baha'u'llah not just starting in paragraph 147, but going from paragraph 147 further on, you see paragraph 151, where he explains further in the subject. This is, in short, the meaning of the day of resurrection, which is what he explains.
Mm-hmm.
So the principle of this covenant, that God doesn't leave us alone, he dwells on the subject of the presence of God, or the divine presence. And that, I will quote it rather than say it. No theme hath been more emphatically asserted in the Holy Scriptures Notwithstanding, they have deprived themselves of this lofty and most exalted rank, the supreme and glorious station. Some have contended that by attainment unto the divine presence is meant the revelation of God in the day of resurrection. Should they assert that revelation of God signifieth a universal revelation, it is clear and evident that such revelation already existed in all things. The truth of this we have already established, inasmuch as we have demonstrated that all things are the recipients and revealers of the splendors of the ideal king. So he goes on further to explain where it's not this, it's not that, but it's this. And the subject of this attainment to the presence of God as the form of the manifestation of God returning from time to time. And this idea of this covenant that we're getting reminded of, that God does not leave us alone.
Mhm.
So a lot of people believe that, especially now Muslims believe that when the end of days come, Jesus Christ will return, but also God will come. God himself will come and visit us. And Baha'u'llah explains that this is impossible because God has never and will never do that except through his intermediary, which is the manifestation of God.
Right, of course.
So he explains the impossibility of this idea, which is commonly believed and understood. So he clarifies the status of the covenant in being the return of God through his manifestation, not through his being that is incompatible without.
Right, the literal descent of God upon the earth. Yeah, that's interesting because I suppose there were Muslims who believed that. For Christians, certainly the notion of the return of Christ isn't the notion of the return of the Father. So I don't think that's an issue for Christians. But then the whole question of what the return of Christ means does become a big issue, I think. And that gets back to the whole issue of the resurrection and this ascending into heaven from the earth. And if you take that literally, you have Jesus would have had a real problem when he got to 15 or 20,000 feet, when there was, the air was thinning out.
So this is where Baha'u'llah explains the elements here. These prophets and chosen ones of God are recipients and revealers of all the unchangeable attributes and names of God. They are the mirrors that truly and faithfully reflect the light of God. Whatsoever is applicable to them is in reality applicable to God himself, who is both the visible and the invisible. The knowledge of him, who is the origin of all things, and attainment unto him are impossible save through knowledge of and attainment unto these luminous beings who proceed from the Son of Truth.
Right. Yeah, that's basic Baha'i theology, you might say.
Yes.
Right here.
Yes, and then he expounds on the effects of that understanding in the following sentences in this paragraph. But this is the element of what it means to attain the divine presence through these prophets, through which and chosen ones, through which we don't have any connection to God directly.
Yeah. I agree.
So the problem, though, comes about in this case, going to the second part of that original question, how do we explain in a simple way and cogently, of course, but how do we explain in a simple way this disparity between understanding that currently exists throughout the world, where religion has been oftentimes a tradition handed down from our forefathers? How do we translate that into something that is not just alive and well, but there are objective tenets that are found even in the writings of all the previous religions that were just not looked at in the way that it's being shown by Baha'u'llah today?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with what you're trying. I think you need to find an example of something which is in all the world's religions, which is something explained or amplified upon by Baha'u'llah, something that's clear and practical, maybe. I think that's the way to go, because that makes it concrete. Does that answer your question?
So an example would be, for example, that in the world of existence is so contrary to what God teaches us to do. So a lot of people will say the reason they don't believe in a God is, how would a God allow so many people in this world to be suffering, to go through such heinous acts, to be subjected to those acts and so forth. Whereas, again, our teachings, the teachings of God, say to do exactly the opposite of what you'd find that is rampant in the world today. So a way to explain this, as you mentioned in a concrete example, is that our only connection really to this God are these divine luminaries, and everything else is not really reflecting. Yes, there are reflections of God's attributes, but it's not reflecting his will, where we've been given that free will to do otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think free will is the key idea here, is that human beings aren't being forced by God to be good. We have to learn how to be good, and we have to learn how to build society structures to help us be good. And I think the examples I would give this is that we have managed to abolish cannibalism and human sacrifice in the past. And by and large, we've abolished slavery, physical human slavery, by and large. And so human beings are making progress. How long it'll take before we can abolish war? Maybe another few hundred years, I don't know. Abolishing poverty, it's hard to say. We've made, in many ways, we've made great progress in parts of the world. And some of that has to do with the way societies are set up. Ultimately, you can't just solve poverty by fixing social structures. You have to fix the cultural structures, and that requires spiritual teachings. So I think these are the kinds of examples I would give for how humanity has been progressing. And have we a long way to go? Certainly. But we have made progress. So I think those are the direction, those examples I would give. I mean, I think, to me, one of the best examples of where society needs to progress is something that is increasingly obvious to people, but they would never think about. Every religion in the world forbids lying. Every religion forbids lying. What's the basis of modern Western political systems? Lying is the basis. I'm the best. You have to believe me. I'll do all these things for you. And that guy who's my opponent is terrible. He'll destroy the society. He'll destroy our country. This is all lies. It's all lies. And how do you eliminate those lies? By having an election system with no mentioning of names at all, no campaigning, and no nominating. And you eventually educate the society, you educate the people, so that they have to decide who they're going to vote for based on character, not based on where people stand. Because if you start, as soon as you start basing your elections on issues, then people lie. They'll lie.
So you're talking about a system that effectively chooses its leaders rather than just simply electing those who vaunt themselves over others, choosing leaders to lead them from among themselves that are known for their character and their abilities to accomplish a certain task.
How we will do it in the future for all of humanity, I don't know. I think it probably will mean that people in neighborhoods will have to choose representatives. And then those representatives will get together at the city level and choose a city council. And representatives at the city level will get together to choose a state government. And the government level will get together to choose federal. That's how it'll have to work, because the way it works even within the Baha'i community is that the National Convention in the United States, you've got 171 delegates. Now, you don't have to vote for those 171 people, but at least you've got people who've been selected who understand the process of trying to choose people who are mature and who have good characters. And at least you're getting 171 of them together to meet each other. They can choose people who aren't delegates, and occasionally it happens, but at least you're getting, the cream is rising to the top, you might say, in some sense. The other thing that happens, frankly, is that even if you choose people randomly, it'll be better. As soon as you start the sifting process, even then randomly will work better. Because then you'll choose people who don't want to be corrupted. That to me is a good example of where there's a new teaching from Baha'u'llah that applies the basic ethics of religion in a new way. And frankly, I think most of the Baha'i teachings can be seen that way. I'm working on a paper that's going to be published soon titled Oneness, Unity, and Their Ethical Imperatives. If we understand the oneness of humanity truly, if we understand the nobility of all human beings truly, it follows from that men and women must be equal, that the society must create a society where they're equal, that we have to create a society which is not based on discrimination, that doesn't have redlining built into it, doesn't have institutional racism built into its baked into it. You know, the ethical imperatives of the oneness of humanity and the unity of humanity require that. You know, and people will say, "Oh, we believe in the oneness of humanity. Of course, we believe in the oneness of humanity. We know everyone is one." But then they don't think about the ethical implications of that. And Baha'u'llah has brought those ethical implications. I'll give an example. When Abdu'l-Baha was in the United States in 1912, he spoke to the Unitarians in Boston. And then 2 days later, he spoke to the Free Religious Association, which are basically people who are kind of ethical post-Unitarian people. A lot of the Unitarians went to that conference too. So he's being introduced at the Free Religious Association conference in Boston, May 1912. And the speaker who's introducing him says, "You know, I walked across Boston Common with a friend of mine who heard him speak at the Unitarian meeting 2 days ago. And my friend said, you know, he didn't say anything new. He didn't say anything new." And then this man says, "And you know, this is the great thing about Abdu'l-Baha. He believes the same things we believe, and he's from Iran." Which frankly, I would consider a bit of a put down for Abdu'l-Baha. But this is how he was introduced. They're saying that because Abdu'l-Baha is talking about the oneness of humanity and all that. Oh yes, we believe in the oneness of humanity. Abdu'l-Baha was trying to matchmake Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew just a couple weeks earlier. And then they get married and you have your first interracial marriage in the American Baha'i community. And you think any of those Unitarians were in favor of interracial marriage? Abdu'l-Baha did not believe the same thing as they believed. They may have thought he did, but he understood it ethically in a very different way than those Unitarians. Those are the ethical imperatives that the faith brings to our society. Takes the teachings of the other religions and says, you know, folks, you really haven't thought this through, what they mean. Does that answer your question, John? I think it kind of does.
It very much does. And it's very appreciated how you logically went through this passage into action and how it applies in our lives. So this idea you're mentioning of these teachings and the ethical implications, and as we talk about truthfulness, there's a beautiful quote where it says truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues, but that same quote continues, I think, for 2 extra sentences or so forth, and it explains that effect. And Abdu'l-Baha, of course, elaborates on this, ethically speaking, that once you're a truthful person and you commit an act, you're going to be truthful about the act you've committed, and you're going to stop committing those acts that are, again, not in line with what would truthfully be good for you or your society. So then you have the molding of a society in a better direction simply by trying to be a truthful person. So yes, you're not perfect. You're going to have a lot of mistakes coming forward, but being truthful about it allows you to improve.
Right. And I think the other thing the other implication of what I just said is we Baha'is had better get our act together too.
Yes.
Because if the oneness of humanity means treating all people the same, why do African American Baha'is often feel like they're discriminated against in the American Baha'i community? we have not completely achieved what we want to achieve. We have work to do amongst ourselves in order to continue to strengthen unity within the community. In order to really, why is it that we elect 3/4 of the secretaries of the local spiritual assemblies in the United States are women, and 2/3 are of the chairs are men? You know, these are stereotypes, you know, that affect the way we think. So we have work to do too.
Of course we do. And that's extremely important to bring up these statistical realities. When you find that this is the case, there's no avoiding the reality. It's a matter of, again, like you said, how do we move on from here?
Yeah, and I think
So-
3/4 is high. I don't think it's really 3/4 of the secretaries are women. It's probably more like 2/3. So I'm not sure what that number is exactly, so don't quote me. But one of the
course.
things that you will notice is that the larger the Baha'i community, the more likely the secretary is to be male. I think that's another thing you'll notice, which also says something about the perceived notions of who should be executive on a daily basis. But I'm that's not something I have statistics on. That's my impression. So
Interesting. And the thing is, though, that this is ever in flux as well, as you
yes,
also mentioned, the size of a community, also say the demographic distribution of it being, skewed one way or another as well, given the group that is, I guess, among the first Baha'is in that community as one other factor.
yeah, and where that's concerned, the House of Justice not too long ago released statistics that showed that of national spiritual assemblies around the world, 1/3 of all National Assembly members worldwide are women. Now that's not bad considering we're talking about South America and Africa and much of and Asia, where women generally did not have the opportunities that men did. And the way the House of Justice has been able to engineer that situation is to appoint women as auxiliary board members. And then, of course, there's a continuous flux and turnover who's auxiliary board members. And then those women not only have acquired experience, but they've also acquired a reputation for trustworthiness in the community. And so then they'll get elected to institutions as well. So
it's very interesting, that concept.
Yeah.
You're exposing people to leadership positions that wouldn't otherwise be so.
Right, exactly. So the House, I think the House is very careful to find women they can appoint to those positions of auxiliary board member. And then of course the auxiliary board members have to stand up in front of everybody and speak, and that itself is a scary thing that is hard to learn how to do. And that gives people a confidence and an experience that they otherwise wouldn't have. So Peter Burns says, does the flood in Noah mean a flood of unbelief? I suppose you mean there. I think personally, I think that the story in the Old Testament was a literal story. It's a sacred story. And a sacred story talks about a literal event and makes a conclusion from it. Certainly it was a flood of unbelief. It was a flood of infidelity, really, because it was supposedly all of humanity turning their backs from God and from God's guidance. And so God punished humanity by wiping them all out except for the family of Noah. So you could call it a flood of infidelity as well, but it was supposedly a flood of water that, of course, wiped the infidels out, you might say. So I personally, I think you can, if you want to interpret these things the way you're interpreting it here, as in a spiritual way, you're free to do it. Certainly, we're all free to speculate that way, but I think that the original story was understood to be a flood of water wiping out a flood of unbelief. What else?
Well, thank you very much for all of these questions and answers that we went through. And of course, thank you, Dr. Stockman, for coming and speaking on this subject of the covenant and elaborating on some points that really a lot of people are now just getting exposed to. And we appreciate that. More importantly, all of you joining us today, your questions that you brought us, and those of you joining on Facebook and YouTube, thank you for watching, and please, as you find this important for your fireside, please try to use it as a subject and let us know how it goes.
Yeah, that's
So
a good idea.
exactly.
Thanks, John. Good to see
Dr.
everybody.
Stockman, you said you're going to do this again, right? This talk, you're going to be doing it in another community.
In my own hometown, in my own community, in a live in-person event, but not over Zoom. I'll be talking about the covenant in a couple of weeks. I'm not sure quite when now. Mid November, I think it is. Well, it was nice to see everybody.
Yes, and we're also happy that you're able to have this opportunity to practice for that one too.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
People saying thank you, Dr. Stockman, in the comments and so forth.
I see. Thank you. It's good to see everyone. Like I said, good to see Riaz. Haven't seen you in a long time.
Thank you. Thank you much. Glad to see you. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good.
We all hope you have a beautiful weekend, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And Dr. Stockman, again, thank you for joining. We hope you have a beautiful, beautiful weekend ahead. And please, again, we look forward to seeing you all this coming Sunday at 11 a.m.